I think they're going to kill me." No joke. Aileen Seiden's call to her sister from New Orleans wasn't paranoia, it was prophecy. 3 days later, her body would be found in rural Florida, and her two lovers would each claim the other was the killer. But this isn't just a story about a murder in a motel room. It's about how even the strongest people can become systematically trapped through economic dependency, institutional fear, and geographic isolation until escape becomes impossible. Aileen Seiden understood loss before she understood algebra. Her mother died of cancer when Aileen was 9 years old. 5 years later, her father's heart attack left her orphaned at 14. In a world that had taken both her parents before she could legally drive, Aileen made a decision that would define the next 17 years of her life. She would depend on no one but herself. Her older sister Francesca became her legal guardian, but Aileen was determined to build her own foundation. By 31, she'd achieved what many thought impossible for someone who'd faced such early trauma. She worked as a property manager in Miami, paid her own rent in a good apartment, managed her bills independently. Francesca would later tell investigators that her sister was very independent, words that carried the weight of both pride and eventual tragedy. In 2016, Aileen visited Francesca in Los Angeles for an extended stay. It was a peaceful time, one that Francesca would look back on with the sharp pain of hindsight, wishing her sister had never returned to Miami. Because when Aileen went back, she reconnected with someone from her past who would ultimately orchestrate her destruction. Zachary Abel was a name from high school, someone her friends remembered as having a questionable reputation. Aileen's best friend, who would later ask to be called Allie to protect her identity, recalled that Aileen was uncertain about him at first. She wasn't sure about this man from her past. But uncertainty has a way of dissolving when loneliness enters the equation, and by late 2016, Aileen and Zachary were secretly dating. The word secretly matters here. It would become the first bar in the cage that would eventually trap Aileen Seiden. Zachary Abel was living a double life, and he was running out of room to maneuver. For 4 years, he'd been with Cristina Araujo, a woman who didn't just share his bed but also his business. They ran Abel Automotive, a used car dealership in Miami. Cristina wasn't the type of person you simply broke up with. She came from what she called police royalty. Her father, Tony Araujo, was a major in the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department. Mike Picavet, a boat captain who became friends with the couple, witnessed their dynamic firsthand. He watched Zach struggle with a relationship that had become a prison of its own. "If your relationship's not working, just end it and move on," Picavet had told him. But for Zach, it wasn't that simple. He tried to leave Cristina multiple times, but each attempt was met with the same threat. She could make him disappear. These weren't empty words from someone prone to dramatics. Every time Cristina got drunk, she'd remind everyone within earshot about her connections. From the moment Picavet met her, she was quick to mention that her father could take care of any trouble with the law. The threat was always there, hovering in the air like Florida humidity, oppressive and inescapable. Meanwhile, Aileen existed in the shadows of Zach's life. For months, she waited for him to choose her over Cristina. She believed in the possibility of their future together, even as the evidence suggested otherwise. Zach couldn't or wouldn't make that choice. He was caught between a woman he claimed to love and a woman who threatened to destroy him if he left. Then, in 2017, Aileen's carefully constructed independence began to crumble. She lost her job as a property manager. With nowhere else to turn and bills mounting, she made a decision that would prove fatal. She began working at Abel Automotive. She walked directly into Cristina's world, into the heart of the trap that was slowly closing around her. Cristina Araujo's solution to the love triangle was as unexpected as it was toxic. Instead of fighting for Zach or letting him go, she proposed something different. Why didn't the three of them just date each other? On paper, it might have seemed like a modern solution to an age-old problem. No one had to choose. No one had to lose. Everyone could win. Aileen was reluctant at first. The friend she called Allie remembered long conversations about the arrangement. But eventually, whether from loneliness, financial pressure, or genuine hope that it might work, Aileen agreed. The three became what some call a throuple, a polyamorous triad that was supposed to be based on equality and mutual respect. Instead, it became a ticking time bomb. The fighting began almost immediately. What started as arguments fueled by alcohol and jealousy quickly escalated to physical violence. Both women would show up with black eyes and bruises. The violence created a twisted, rotating dynamic. Someone was always the odd one out, always the target. Allie watched her friend's life spiral out of control. One of them always seemed to be the odd man out or was jealous, she recalled. At that point, it just started to spiral out of control. But according to those who knew them, the violence wasn't distributed equally. Allie was clear in her later testimony. Zach was the main aggressor toward Aileen. She would get calls from Aileen begging her to come over because he hurt me again. Allie would rush over, photograph the injuries, document the abuse, and beg her friend to go to the police. But Aileen refused. She was terrified, not just of Zach, but of Christina's connections. The same answer always came back when Allie pressed her to seek help. Christina came from police royalty. She'd gotten away with everything in the past. There would be no solution for someone like Aileen getting hit. The trap wasn't just physical violence. It was the systematic removal of every avenue of escape. Economic dependency through the job at Able Automotive, physical control through violence, psychological imprisonment through the threat of law enforcement connections. Even when the abuse escalated to the point where Aileen ended up in the emergency room, she wouldn't tell doctors where her injuries came from. The medical records would show the injuries but not their cause, another documentation of violence without consequence. By early 2018, the violence had created a map of trauma across Miami. The apartment where fights erupted, the dealership where tensions simmered during work hours, the emergency room where injuries were treated but not reported, the friend's house where bruises were photographed but not acted upon. Each location marked another point where intervention could have happened but didn't. In April 2018, after a particularly violent confrontation between Zach and Christina, something shifted. Aileen and Zach decided they'd had enough. They packed their belongings and left Miami, heading west on what was supposed to be a fresh start. Just the two of them, leaving Christina and her threats behind. Their first stop was Dallas, Texas, where they stayed with a mutual friend. For 48 hours, they existed in a bubble of possibility. They ignored the barrage of calls and texts from Christina, over 150 angry, threatening messages that alternated between panic and rage. For 2 days, they were free. But freedom, it turned out, was temporary. Zach eventually responded to Christina's messages, and in a decision that would prove fatal, he invited her to join them. She flew to Dallas within hours, and the toxic dynamic resumed immediately. The trap that Aileen thought she'd escaped had simply relocated. The trio began making their way back toward Florida, stopping in New Orleans. It was there, in that city known for both celebration and ghosts, that Aileen finally understood the full extent of her danger. She called her sister Francesca in terror. "I think they're going to kill me," she said. Francesca's response was immediate and desperate. "Aileen, run to the nearest gas station. Go tell the person. Call 911. Run. Get out of there. Go." But Aileen's reply revealed the completeness of her entrapment. "I can't." Secretly, Aileen and Allie had devised an escape plan. When the trio reached Tampa, Aileen would slip away and take a Greyhound bus to safety. She would disappear from Zach and Christina's lives forever. It was a simple plan, one that required only that she survive the journey back to Florida. She wouldn't make it to that bus. On April 21, 2018, the trio arrived in Apalachicola, Florida, a small town on what locals call the Forgotten Coast. They went to dinner at the Red Pirate restaurant, played miniature golf, acted like tourists enjoying a casual evening. Surveillance footage captured them stumbling out, laughing. To anyone watching, they looked like people having fun. A local recommended the Sportsman's Lodge Motel, and they reserved the last available room for the night, room 15. They spent April 22nd stocking up on Fireball whiskey and vodka at a local liquor store. The surveillance footage shows all three of them, planning what appeared to be another day of vacation. But the dynamics between them had reached a breaking point. Christina's rage over being left behind in Miami, combined with the knowledge that Zach and Aileen were planning to leave her permanently, had created what the research describes as a powder keg of emotions. The alcohol they'd purchased would only accelerate the explosion. By evening, after hours of heavy drinking in room 15, the violence erupted. What exactly happened in that room would be disputed by the two survivors, each pointing fingers at the other. Christina would later testify that Zach suddenly snapped, attacking Aileen with his fists, punching her repeatedly, even biting her face. She claimed the violence was unlike anything she'd ever seen, that Zach grabbed a shower curtain rod and used it to continue the assault, then reached for his wooden walking stick and beat Aileen until the stick broke. Zach's version was entirely different. He would claim he woke up to find Christina standing over Aileen's dead body, having killed her while he slept. What isn't disputed is what the crime scene revealed. Room 15 had become what investigators would later describe as a chamber of horrors. Blood covered nearly every surface. The amount was so extensive that even seasoned investigators were disturbed. Lead investigator Ronnie Jones would later say, "She had bruises from head to toe covering her entire body. She suffered. I've never seen anything like it." The medical examiner determined that Aileen had been beaten so severely that nearly all of her ribs were broken. Her injuries were compared to those typically seen in high-speed car crashes. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, chest, and abdomen, causing massive internal hemorrhaging. When Zach and Christina woke up the next morning, Aileen was dead. Rather than call for help, they made a horrifying decision. They wrapped her body in a sheet and carried her out of room 15. Surveillance cameras captured only two figures walking to their car. What the cameras couldn't show was the bundle they carried between them. They drove 6 miles to a deserted cul-de-sac off Highway 98 and dumped Aileen's body in the woods. Zach would later describe the callous disposal. He put his foot inside the vehicle and picked her up by her arm and her foot and swung her into the woods. Then they returned to room 15 and tried to erase what they'd done. They cleaned with vinegar, scrubbed at the blood, attempted to eliminate the evidence. But blood has a way of telling its own story. When investigators later sprayed luminol in the bathroom, the entire room lit up, revealing blood stains that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. The shower curtain rod still bore traces of Aileen's blood, along with a perfect palm print from Zachary Abel's hand. The broken pieces of the walking stick were found both in the room and in their vehicle, with Aileen's DNA still present. On the morning of April 23rd, a couple went fishing at a quiet pond off Highway 98 in East Point, Florida. Instead of the peaceful morning they'd planned, they discovered the battered body of a young woman. She had no identification, nothing to indicate who she was. For the moment, she was simply Jane Doe. Within 24 hours, Lieutenant Ronnie Jones received a call that changed everything. A housekeeper at the Sportsman's Lodge had discovered blood in room 15. When investigators arrived, they immediately recognized they were dealing with something horrific. The bed was covered in dried blood. Impossible to miss, impossible to explain away. By the time police began searching for them, Zach and Christina had fled back to South Florida. They showed up at Mike Picovet's door around 9:30 that morning. When Picovet asked where Aileen was, Christina's response was immediate. "Oh, she ran away." But Picovet didn't believe them. He pressed harder, and Zach broke down. "She's dead," he admitted. According to Picovet, Zach claimed Christina had killed Aileen while he was asleep and had convinced him not to call 911. Christina, for her part, told Picovet where they'd dumped the body. Picovet was terrified. He knew what these people were capable of and feared for his own safety, but he also knew what he had to do. He contacted Christina's father, Tony Araujo. This was the moment when Christina's supposed protection would either shield her or fail her. Tony Araujo, to his credit, immediately brought Picovet to the sheriff's office to make a formal statement. There would be no cover-up, no use of influence to protect his daughter. The police royalty that Christina had wielded as a threat throughout her relationship became the very mechanism that ensured justice. When Picovet was shown a photograph of the victim found on Highway 98, he confirmed what investigators suspected. It was Aileen Seiden. Police descended on Picovet's home where Zach and Christina were preparing to leave. They were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The forensic evidence against them was overwhelming. Aileen's blood on the weapons, Zach's palm print in blood, DNA evidence throughout the room and car. The cases would take nearly 6 years to come to trial. In 2023, Christina Araujo accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and agreed to testify against Zach in exchange for a 25-year sentence. Having already served about 5.5 years, she would be eligible for release in her late 50s. Zachary Abel's trial began in January 2024. Christina took the stand and testified about the brutal beating she claimed to have witnessed. But Zach's defense attorney painted a different picture, arguing that Christina was the real killer, motivated by jealousy when Zach and Aileen tried to leave her behind. The defense pointed to the threatening text messages Christina had sent before joining them on the trip, including one that read, "You come near me, ho, I will kill you." After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. They convicted Zach of second-degree murder, the same charge Christina had pleaded guilty to. They couldn't decide if he had specifically intended to kill Aileen, but they were convinced he had participated in her death. On April 10, 2024, almost exactly 6 years after Aileen's murder, Judge Allman sentenced Zachary Abel to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Aileen Seiden's story isn't just that she died, but that so many people saw it coming and couldn't stop it. Allie, her best friend, had photographed bruises and begged her to go to police. She'd warned Aileen repeatedly that someone was going to end up dead. Francesca, her sister, had wanted her out of the situation, had pleaded with her to run when she called from New Orleans. Mike Pickaway had expressed his fears that Aileen wouldn't survive the trip, had seen the dynamics that made violence inevitable. Each of these people represents a point where intervention might have changed the outcome, but they also represent the horrible reality of domestic violence, that knowing someone is in danger and being able to help them escape that danger are two very different things. The system that should have protected Aileen, law enforcement, medical professionals, social safety nets, all failed not because they were corrupt, but because the trap that held her was so complete. Aileen's fear of Christina's connections kept her from police. Her economic dependency kept her from leaving. The geographic isolation of their final trip removed her from any support system that might have intervened. The violence escalated not in spite of people knowing about it, but perhaps because the abusers knew that knowledge without power to act meant nothing. The case reveals an uncomfortable truth about domestic violence. It often happens in plain sight. Friends document injuries. Family members receive desperate phone calls. Medical professionals treat wounds. Everyone can see the trap closing, but the victim, through a combination of fear, dependency, and systematic isolation, cannot escape it. Aileen Seiden was 31 years old when she died. She had survived losing both parents as a child. She had built an independent life in Miami. She had dreams and plans and a bus ticket to freedom that she would never use. Her story isn't just about the violence that ended her life in room 15 of a forgotten motel on Florida's Forgotten Coast. It's about how even the strongest among us can be slowly, systematically trapped until escape becomes impossible, and how sometimes all the warning signs in the world aren't enough to save someone caught in that trap. The smell of vinegar in room 15 has long since faded. The blood evidence has been photographed, cataloged, and filed away. Zachary Abel will spend the rest of his life in prison. Christina Araujo will serve her 25 years. Justice, in its slow and imperfect way, was served. But for Aileen Seiden, who called her sister from New Orleans knowing she was going to die, who had friends who loved her but couldn't save her, who chose to trust the wrong people with her heart and paid with her life, for her, justice came too late. The trap had already closed.